Thank you so much for joining our online workshop today, Building Resiliency and Cross-Cultural Connections. My name is Natasha Bayes, and I'm the Director of Volunteer Engagement here at School on Wheels. Joining me today to present on this topic is Cody Reed, our School on Wheels Training and Regional Specialist. For the purpose of sound quality, all participants are muted. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it in the questions pane, and we'll be sure to answer them. We do encourage participation. Just a little background on our presenter, Cody Reed. He has a cultural anthropology degree from Cal State Fullerton and joined our organization in 2016 after working 3 years in Sub-Saharan Africa. During that time, Cody served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Malawi, helping to improve opportunities for women and girls. So thank you so much, Cody, for presenting on this topic. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction. And I also worked in Uganda for 6 months as well. So I do have a bit of a background in this particular topic, and it's something I really enjoy. And just before we get started, I just want to say the reason I think this training is important, especially right now for our students and what we do here at School on Wheels, is just to improve communication and make sure we're able to really meet these students where they are and make an impact on their lives in a positive way. So what we're going to talk about today, our agenda for the day, is number one, understanding culture and diversity. So kind of define what we're talking about a little bit so we are all on the same page. I'm sure you all know what it is, but we want to make sure that we're using the same context here. Working with vulnerable populations. Then we'll talk about fostering inclusivity, how to actually make this stuff hopefully work with your students while working with your students. And then we'll actually talk about your own resiliency, volunteer resiliency, and how to kind of hopefully make this work for you where you can actually stick with us for the full year commitment and continue to make a great impact on your students, which I'm sure you're already doing. But to get started, the first thing we want to do is, like I said, we want to define what we're talking about here. So we're going to define culture. And I'm sure, again, that a lot of you know what we're talking about, and there's a lot of different definitions out there for what that could mean. But the one we're going to use today is specifically from anthropology. So it's the system of shared beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, and artifacts that the members of a society use to cope with their world and with one another, and that are transmitted from generation to generation through learning. So as we all know, culture is, of course, a universally human concept. It defines the borders of what we consider acceptable behavior, and it's a prime mover of technology, industry, philosophy, and of course, the arts is one that everyone knows it from. Culture is everything we do. It's a vantage point that has been passed to us as a way of understanding the world from the perspective of our own history, ecology, and values. This also means that culture is fluid and dynamic and adapts to these conditions as they change, and each generation tweaks it as necessary to keep up with changing circumstances. It's also important to recognize that no culture exists in a bubble and is affected by encounters with other ways of being and changes accordingly. So in America, this issue is magnified as we are a nation of immigrants and people from all over the world. Defining a quintessential American culture becomes almost impossible. This is important for your tutoring because though you may share a common nationality with your students, there are still major cultural gaps based on gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic background that need to be treated with openness and sensitivity. So to continue, now that we have defined what culture is, we must understand what culture does, what its purpose is. So culture is the creation of personal identity. We all have multiple identities that make us who we are, some of which are assigned to us, such as our sex, race, our name, ethnicity, and so on. Generally, we have little control over these aspects as they are based on the values and perceptions of the society or family that we're born into. And then there are the identities that we kind of assign to ourselves, such as your gender identity, your style, your career that you might choose, certain titles that you might give to yourself in that kind of realm, like gamer, hipster, car guy, artist, whatever it might be. But all of this, of course, combines to create who you are. So everything we do is an expression of our culture and our identity. So we are always broadcasting to the world how we'd like to be perceived and how we see ourselves. And of course, these identities can be complex and very often contradictory. We all come from a diverse background, most of us containing multiple ethnic or cultural identities brought on from family and whatever else. For instance, in my family, what I've been told anyway, we're Irish, German, Scottish, and also my father, he's from the East Coast, my mother's from the rural South, and I was born here in Southern California. There's political differences, and all these things over my years of, living, have coalesced into becoming my unique personality. So all of these things, don't always agree with each other. Some of these values and things that are imparted are contradictory, and it's important to understand that, contradiction is a part of who we are as human beings. So the process of growing up, of course, is confusing. It's complicated, as the multiplicity and contradictory nature of these cultures are forged into that individual. Therefore, your identity becomes deeply personal. It's who you are, and if your identity is challenged, that's when you become defensive, rebellious, unwilling to listen, all those issues, and I'm sure you face some of that with your students. This is important to understand for your tutoring, because if you can leave your own preconceived notions of who this person, your student, should be at the door and try to understand how they see themselves from their own perspective, they're going to be much more willing to trust you, work with you, and hopefully ultimately learn with you as well. So therefore, our approach when working with these students should always be one of cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is another anthropological principle that says all cultures are unique amalgams of a specific set of circumstances, their history, environment, ecology, etc., and to be understood must be viewed through its own cultural lens. So to put that more simply, there's no one right way to live. People find the way that works best for them based on their own environments and needs. And therefore, what may seem illogical, silly, or even disgusting to an outsider is perfectly normal and logical to an insider. So in the case of our students, it's important to note that just because you don't understand their approach to something does not mean that it's wrong, or that at least in their mind there isn't a reason for why they're doing what they're doing. So instead of just forcing them to do something, your way, try to understand the underlying cause and adjust your methods accordingly. A really great quote that I found while doing this, actually one of my favorite quotes, besides the one that just appeared on screen, which is Walt Whitman, also great. But one from Mr. Einstein is that everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it's going to grow up its whole life thinking it's stupid. So the point being, of course, you want to identify an individual's, their own strengths from their own perspective and cultivate what they've already got and make that better. Don't try and force them to become something that they're not. So a little bit on the demographics of School on Wheels here. Let me put these charts up for you here first. School on Wheels, of course, is an increasingly diverse student body, as well as an incredibly diverse tutoring pool. And as you can see from the charts presented, there is a distinct cultural gap between the majority of our students and the largest percentage of our tutors, with 80% of our students identifying as either Black or Hispanic, while 59% of our tutors are identifying as either white or Asian. And this is just one aspect of culture. Obviously, there's a lot more that you could probably find charts on. I don't think we necessarily get all those demographics like sexual orientation, gender identities, that sort of thing. But it kind of gives you an idea of the gaps that do exist. The point being that in many ways, you, our tutors, and the students you mentor are coming from different worlds, and feigning colorblindness is just being unproductive, and it's actually dismissive of someone else's unique personal experience and identity. But acknowledging those differences and being open-minded and willing to learn from each other's experiences is going to be the best way to encourage growth and understanding, and to promote an inclusive tutoring environment where all parties are going to feel heard and represented, which of course is the ultimate goal that we want when working with these students. We want everyone to feel like they're included. So the next section we're going to talk about here from the agenda, of course, is working with vulnerable populations. And the first thing we want to do, again, before we really get into that, is to define some terms. So again, we're all on the same page for what we're talking about here. And the first one, of course, is vulnerable population. A lot of you might have heard that term before. A lot of times it's referred to in medicine, dealing with people with, dealing with access to medicine, that sort of thing. But in this case, we're talking about minority groups that are facing undue societal barriers or a lack of representation and a distinct lack of social power because of perceived differences to the status quo. So this can be because of race, again, gender, age, sexual orientation, ethnicity, socioeconomic, or even health status. These groups are generally not listened to or believed when speaking out against oppression or adversity of some kind due to a perceived opposition to the majority society, a perceived lack of understanding of mainstream culture, or, in the case of our students mainly, an expectation of submission towards traditional power structures. So in other words, they're vulnerable because their agency over their own need is taken away and being placed in the hands of people that, quote unquote, know better. And this happens a lot with kids. It's very easy to think that they don't know what they're going through, or to, kind of jump on them that way. So that's that one. And then the next one there, of course, is microaggression. So some of you might have heard this term before, but just to define it for everybody, it's a statement, an action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. And these are behaviors or ways of speaking that we have learned through media consumption, family members, peer groups, so on, and can be very damaging to relationships without realizing it. So it's important to understand that these are things we do every day, and usually they're unintentional, but they demonstrate our privilege and highlight someone else's otherness. To avoid this kind of negativity, we have to always be mindful of how we've been socialized to think in ways that may be inappropriate or hurtful, and listen if someone tells you they were hurt by what you said or did, and not be defensive about it. Just listen to what they have to say and then try and address it from that point. And then, of course, the next one there is voice. This is, of course, an agency by which a particular point of view is expressed or represented, and it's the right to express an opinion. And I'm sure any of you that may have attended one of my introductory trainings that I do would remember my spiel about giving students a voice, which I find very important. This is, of course, in my opinion, the most important impact that you can make on one of these students. Giving these students a voice gives them a stake in their own education, and anyone will be more engaged if they feel that they're a part of what is going on and not just a situation is happening to them. And on that same note, of course, is empowerment. And again, I'm sure a lot of you already understand what empowerment is, but just to define it clearly for everyone, the process of becoming stronger and more confident, especially in controlling one's life and claiming one's rights. The first step to empowerment, of course, is making someone feel heard. And when you give a student a voice in your tutoring sessions, you begin to grow their self-confidence, and they learn what they have to say is important and that they have the right to express an opinion like anyone else. And we'll discuss strategies a little later on how to actually make sure a student is feeling included, listened to, and ultimately empowered and confident, which is what we want from all of our students. And so to be a little more specific about giving a student a voice, hopefully the biggest takeaway of this workshop, again, is how to better communicate with your students so that you can make a largest impact on their education, and listening is such a key component of communication. So listening is something, of course, we do every day at work, with your spouse, with your family, and you would think that we'd be a lot better at it than we tend to be. However, research suggests that on average, people only retain 25 to 50% of what we actually hear. This is dismal, and I'm sure we could all use an improvement in this area. So we will now look at 4 main techniques of active listening to make sure that we are getting the full message when talking to a student, family, to students or the families that we work with. All right, so the first one I know seems incredibly obvious, but it's actually really important. So paying attention. Give the speaker your undivided attention and acknowledge the message. Recognize that nonverbal communication is speaking loudly when you're with somebody. So some tips to make sure that happens: look at the speaker directly. Put aside distracting thoughts, which again we mentioned in the initial tutoring training, just to kind of be in the moment with your student. Don't mentally prepare what you're going to say next. Is really important. Make sure you're getting the full message and not trying to think of what clever thing you're going to come up with to say after that person. And of course, pay attention to the speaker's body language. And then at the same token, as you're paying attention to their body language, make sure you're giving them positive body language as well. So nod along, smile, use other facial expressions, as the conversation goes. Certain things are going to be, different for whatever conversation you're having. And also try to make your posture open and inviting, like you want to hear what's being said. So important. And also encourage the speaker to continue by using verbal cues like yes or things I'm sure you've used a lot and you understand what we're talking about there. And then we also want to provide feedback. So our personal filters, assumptions, judgments, and beliefs can distort what we hear. So as a listener, your role, of course, is to understand what is being said. This may require you to actually reflect on what is being said and ask questions. So try, a really good way to deal with that is try and paraphrase what's being said, like what I'm hearing is, or it sounds like you're saying, and so on. Also, try and ask clarifying questions as you need them to make sure you understand what the message is. So saying things like, what did you mean when you say, or is this what you mean? And then kind of paraphrasing a little bit back. Also try and periodically summarize what the student is saying so that everyone's on the same page, of course. And the next one there, of course, is deferring judgment. So interrupting is a waste of time when someone is speaking. It frustrates the speaker and it only limits the full understanding of the message for the listener. So make sure you're allowing the speaker to finish whatever they have to say, whether it's a student or another tutor, the family, whoever, but make sure you allow them to say all of what they're trying to say first, and never interrupt with counter arguments. Always try and wait till the end, and then if you have a counter argument or if you're still, it's a conversation back and forth, but don't do it while they're speaking. And then the last one there, of course, is responding appropriately. So active listening is a model for respect and understanding. You are gaining information and perspective, and you add nothing by attacking the speaker or otherwise putting him or her down. Now, I'm not suggesting, of course, that any of you are putting your students down. More or less, I think more the interruption message is the most important. Always try and make sure you're hearing the whole message before you respond. Always try and be open and honest in your responses, especially with children. It's so important to be honest as much as possible. And of course, always try and live by the golden rule here. Try and treat others as you think they would like to be treated. That's going to be one of the best things. And Calvin here, of course, don't be like Calvin. He's a bad example of an active listener. So it's just a funny cartoon. Don't take that to heart. All right. So moving on. So a little bit more on giving a student a voice. Another way to make sure that your students are feeling empowered and heard is to make sure that you acknowledge that they may understand what they are really struggling with and set goals for your sessions together accordingly. One of the greatest failures that I've seen in my development experience is the refusal of aid organizations that genuinely want to help and do good to listen to what the community tells them are the biggest problems that they are facing and to actually address those problems. In many cases, one of these groups comes in with their own goals in mind and little idea of what is happening on the ground with the people that will actually be affected. And they implement their project, put someone in charge, and they leave. And more often than not, the project fails within a short period of time because they didn't actually address the real issue. So in the case of our students in your tutoring sessions, if a tutor comes with their own expectation of what a student is struggling with, and develops goals for tutoring without input from the student, they may be missing an underlying cause or something that the student would be more likely to engage with. So it's crucial that we meet these students where they are and listen to what they tell us, or when they tell us what they feel they need the most help with. So some tips for creating a better and more achievable goals with your student is number one, within the first few sessions, discuss goal setting with your student and find out what they would like to achieve from your time together. And obviously that can be a little tough. Sometimes they can be a little unmotivated to talk to you. So just take your time with it and make sure you're trying to find out what it is that they would like to gain from your time together. Number two, make sure they understand the difference between a short and a long-term goal. And remember to reassess your own goals and idea of achievement appropriately. So once you guys kind of understand the time constraints that you're dealing with and what you guys are trying to do, make sure that your own idea of what you guys can achieve is going to change, because as you get to know your student, you're going to, kind of have to mold to what they want to, or what they're going to be able to work on and how long you have and all of that. And then finally there, also always try to shoot for achievable progress. This is so important because as we all know, an hour a week is not much. So always try to shoot for quality over quantity. Work on things that will make the biggest impact, not get the most paperwork done. And another great tip that I received actually from Allison, who some of you might know is our manager here at Skid Row Learning Center, is to remember you may have learned things differently as many of the methodologies have changed with Common Core in the last 10 years, 15 years, or however long it's been since you've been in school. So to ensure consistency for the student, if you notice that you guys are on different pages, take a beat and ask, how did the teacher show you, or teach me the way that you learn. That way you're not confusing the kid by bringing in different ways of doing things that they may not be doing in school or being taught not to do, or so on. All right, so the next section we're going to talk about here is a little bit is checking your own personal bias and preconceptions. So one of the most important things, again, that I've learned when working in development and with vulnerable populations in general is to always remain open-minded and self-reflective. And as we discussed earlier, it is important to acknowledge diversity. But in the same vein, it's also important to recognize and acknowledge how your experience and upbringing has influenced your own personal biases and preconceptions. So for instance, you may have been raised in a world where high achievement in school was assumed of you, and therefore had others, like your teachers, coaches, parents, so on, invest heavily in your education, or perhaps food or financial insecurity was not something you were ever faced with. The point being that to be able to work effectively and positively with these kids, we must be able to put aside what we may assume they can achieve based on how we perceive their circumstances, and help give them access to the best possible chance to succeed that we can. And of course, self-reflection can be difficult. We all know that. Having one's perception of the world as one has always known it challenged is hard. It's not easy, and everyone is born with these kind of problematic biases or preconceptions that are inherited culturally or through personal experience. This means that the responsibility to alter these mindsets falls to all of us. And as much as your work with these children will challenge your own preconceptions and personal beliefs, it's also going to challenge the students' preconceived notions as well. Therefore, there are three key areas that we want to pay attention to while tutoring to make sure that we're checking our own biases as we go along. And the first one there is language. So the words we use are powerful, and language shapes our point of view. And because of that, language can be one of the most powerful tools for empowerment as well as discrimination. At the beginning of this section, we define the term microaggression, and it's through speech that we've inherited many insensitive or discriminatory idioms, turns of phrases, or derogatory stereotypes. And a really good example of this type of microaggression from my own experience was when I was in Peace Corps working in Africa. It was fairly common to hear volunteers refer to the expats or Peace Corps volunteers as a whole as white people, even though we were a really diverse group of young people working there. So I never realized until I had an African American volunteer tell me that she felt hurt and marginalized by this, that I was even saying anything wrong. And in referring to all foreigners as white people, I was essentially saying that non-white volunteers' experiences weren't worth mentioning, or that only the white volunteer experience mattered. Obviously, this wasn't intentional, but it's how it came off to somebody else. And these are tough waters to navigate. We all know that, but this is why communication becomes so important. And in the case of our students at School on Wheels, make sure to keep their situation in mind and be mindful of how your words may be interpreted by the student, and try and watch out for trigger words as well. So this is another piece of advice that I received from Allison here at the Skid Row Learning Center. Trigger words with these kids a lot of the times can be something like, telling them, go ask your mom or dad, or go ask mom and dad. Because some of them, they may not be able to, whether that parent isn't there for them or whatever else. That can be hard on them. Or telling them to do a piece of homework at home. Obviously, they may not, have a home to go do the homework in, or they may, take that as a hurtful comment towards their experience. And that can be tough to navigate. So it's just about being mindful about how we're speaking to the students. And then, of course, there's privilege. So unfortunately, this has been perceived as a bit of a touchy subject, and it's very easy to have a negative or defensive reaction if someone's ever asked you to check your privilege. However, it's crucial to understand what is actually being asked of you here, and that it's not an insult, or it's not a question of whether or not you have ever had any struggles in your own life, but rather it's someone asking you to reflect on the ways that your social status, race, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, so on, might have given you an advantage, even if it was unearned or unasked for, while their social status may have given them a disadvantage. In the case of our students, you may never have one of them actually ask you this, at least not directly, but that means that the responsibility of being held accountable rests with you. And therefore, before you begin your tutoring, or if you have a student now, think of the ways that maybe you have received privilege, or where your students may suffer a disadvantage for things that neither of you, of course, has control over. And be mindful that though you may not fully understand their position, that you acknowledge that that inequality exists, and find ways to use the advantages you have been given for the benefit of everybody, for the benefit of the student, for the benefit of the families when you can. And obviously, just you being here to tutor is a great way to start doing that. So you're already on the right track. And then, of course, lastly is experience. So lastly, our preconceptions and biases are, of course, shaped through our lived experiences. So from birth, we're learning culture, the good and the bad. We learn traditional values and stories, but we also learn archaic stereotypes and beliefs as well. This early cultural training shapes the way we perceive the world, and some experiences may actually reinforce some of these negative preconceived notions, and they become a part of our unique identity and point of view. So for example, think of like phobias. The rational fears usually gained through trauma or inherited from somebody that kind of, passed it on to you, mother, father, family member of some nature, caretaker. So say your grandma had a really mean dog that bit you once as a child, right? You may grow up with an extreme fear of all dogs, even though that one incident with one dog doesn't necessarily represent how all dogs behave or that, all dogs are scary. But it kind of becomes who you are, and it's hard to kind of deal with it. And if that if that identity or if that idea isn't challenged, it becomes really hard to get rid of it because you just keep assuming that all dogs are mean. So therefore, it's crucial to try and see the world from as many perspectives as possible, those that agree and those that challenge your own assumptions. This is where we can really make a positive impact with our students, because just in tutoring them and actually listening to what they have to say, you're sharing your own perspectives as well as learning theirs and creating more understanding and better communication. So some really good tips for how to kind of help gain those perspectives. You can read articles, our workshops like you're doing now, talking to other volunteers, talking to families, talking to shelter staff that you may work with. All are great ways to start understanding those different perspectives and become a more well-rounded tutor. The more you can understand, the better you're going to be able to work with these kids. So now what we want to talk about is fostering inclusivity. So how to make this kind of the best experience for everyone involved, essentially. So the main thing, again, that I would like to achieve with this workshop is a way to bring tutors and students closer together and to help strengthen those relationships and be able to speak openly about issues we are facing working in such a cross-cultural, diverse kind of environment, and ultimately to create a more inclusive experience for everybody. So throughout this training, we've already discussed the benefits and difficulties of people of differing backgrounds working together, and I would now like to highlight a few of those more specifically. The fact that you are here at all and want to do this tutoring tells me that you guys are willing to try and understand someone who may not look like, sound like, or even had the opportunity to live like you have. And in doing so, I hope that you've gained some great perspective along the way so far. But it's not always easy, right? So there's always strengths and challenges to cross-cultural interaction that we want to kind of go over here. And with this kind of work, we open our minds to the broader worldview, but it can also be really difficult to confront those long-held beliefs, as those beliefs are part of your identity, and challenging them, can be uncomfortable and, of course, sometimes painful. So really, that's more just about your own resiliency and being able to kind of keep going forward and keep that open-minded point of view and just kind of understand as best you can as possible from others. However, though, when you achieve that more open-minded perspective and let others whose experience and therefore approach is going to be radically different from your own be heard, you can increase the opportunity for new innovation and achieve a betterment of the world for everybody. But it can be tough to learn and adjust to new methods of doing something, especially when you've kind of spent your whole life doing it your way. The best thing to combat this, of course, is to not be dismissive, even if you think something won't work. So even if you don't think it's going to work, give it a shot anyway. Innovation is as much about failure as it is about success. So kind of leave room for that failure to happen sometimes. And finally, the ultimate strength of cross-cultural interaction, and one that will hopefully benefit your sessions as well as your regular life as well, is improved communication and stronger connection with those you work with and the world around you. But building, of course, that trust initially can be difficult, and it takes patience and a recognition of your own shortcomings. So if you can be introspective enough to try and understand the ways you have been taught to be biased, then there are ways to overcome those biases and break down barriers that may prevent a really impactful relationship. And again, another great quote I found from this author, Do Zantamata, about this particular point is that it's easy to judge, but it's much more difficult to understand. Understanding requires compassion, patience, and a willingness to believe that good hearts sometimes choose poor methods. And through judging, we separate. Through understanding, we grow. So just trying to understand and build these bridges is always going to make your tutoring sessions, hopefully, go smoother in the long run. So to continue talking about mutual learning here, now that we've talked about how to develop a more self-aware perspective and more open-minded attitude to create an environment of better understanding between tutors and students, now we're going to talk about how to apply these techniques to foster a more inclusive and hopefully impactful educational experience for everybody. So the first thing to keep in mind is that learning is always a two-way street. And as much as you may have to share and teach, you also have to learn. So the best you can do, where was I? I'm sorry. I was on a roll there. Unfortunately, so you have an equal amount to learn. So unfortunately, as many of us come to realize, the educational system in America has long held a strong emphasis on learning from a very Western European, mainly male perspective. And this is obviously problematic because history, science, literature, mathematics, any other academic subject you can think of, has had a diverse set of influencers and champions coming from a hugely diverse set of backgrounds and experiences. In fact, it would be almost impossible for them not to have, as none of us lives in a bubble and none of these things were developed in a bubble. So therefore, as a tutor, when prepping your tutoring sessions or even just thinking about what you will work on with your student, do your research. Try and expand your own learning and find stories, influencers, icons, or perspectives that your students are going to connect with. Help your student to envision themselves as a scientist, a mathematician, archaeologist, a king, queen, whatever. Show them people that look like them or that have come from a similar circumstance who have gone on to change the world. One of the greatest privileges you're going to be able to give to any child is to show them that their aspirations are possible and that people they can see themselves in have influenced change. So when working with your students, try and always allow space for creativity. Make sure they understand that in brainstorming, there are no bad ideas. Encourage them to share whatever crazy thought they have and how to apply a method to see if it would actually work. Try and use that scientific method to see if they can test and see if their theory is going to work the way they think it is. And creating a safe space to test new ideas is the best way to find new innovations. Sometimes the things that seem the most impractical at first end up becoming the most useful. So it's always worth a shot. Let them, take the shot sometimes. And as we build our students' confidence in their own ideas and creativity, use that fertile mental soil, if you will, to cultivate their critical thinking skills. You can always go deeper. Allow for experimentation, but also make sure that you help them question their own methods and think through problems, not just trying to answer them or just guess what the answer may be. Again, the point of teaching is not to be an encyclopedia. Critical thinking is about learning how to work through a puzzle and analyzing why we think the way that we think. So never be satisfied with a simple yes or no. Encourage the students to elaborate and explain their process, because discussing it out loud is always going to help them understand their own inner processes a little bit better. And it's also something you can do for yourself as a tutor. Also, make sure you are developing your own critical thinking skills, and make sure if asked why by the student, you never give a just because response. Recognize that you don't fully understand and find the best answer, not the first answer, even if you have to take a beat and come back to it later on. Let the student see that you are participating and developing along with them, that they're not in this by themselves. That's always going to be more encouraging. And finally, and most importantly, always encourage the students to participate, making sure that you're never pushing them to do something they don't want to do, but you're providing opportunities for them to feel included. So for instance, if you're in a group setting, this is a really good way to look at this, and you have a student that is shy or maybe doesn't want to participate in whatever activity you're doing, see if they'd be willing to offer a suggestion of something that you could do that they would be willing to participate in. And again, I know that can be a little tough because sometimes they're not motivated to speak with you, but sometimes it takes a little probing, a little bit of kind of patience with them, but you can get there. So this is where building that relationship of mutual understanding is so important, because we never want to embarrass a student, of course, but we do want them to get involved. And if you understand what they like and what they don't, or how they prefer to communicate, you can adapt activities to suit them in a way where they will be open to getting in the action. And also, if you're in a group setting, it's a great opportunity to encourage each student to share something about their own culture or family, and use your sessions as a platform to share those experiences and develop perspective for you and the students. But of course, always, always, always ensure that all involved are showing respect to everyone else. Make sure all the students are feeling respected, and the rules are very clear for what you want to get out of that. Oh, and I almost forgot my little images here. I'll put them up now. The last one's my favorite. Kills me every time. All right. So moving on. Now we're going to come to the final part here, which is volunteer resiliency. And obviously this is about you guys. So we've talked about how to work with the students, how to kind of adapt to working with the students. But this section is about how to make sure that you guys are able to deal with these challenges and hopefully move forward with the student, even if you guys are struggling or finding it difficult or challenging in other respects. So I would really like to acknowledge at this point that what you guys do as tutors is challenging, it's sometimes frustrating, and often thankless. And hopefully, ultimately, it's fulfilling for you, despite the other things. I certainly understand better than most the difficulties faced by volunteers, and I know just how hard it can be to keep that same level of commitment when you don't feel like you're seeing progress. And that being said, developing your personal resilience is incredibly important, meaning your ability to adjust, of course, and change to overcome challenges. And there are going to be many ways that you may have faced or have faced challenges in your tutoring. I'm sure most of you have faced motivational issues with your students or communication issues with parents, shelters, or even maybe your regional coordinator with School on Wheels. And all of these, of course, can be equally frustrating. And what I want to discuss now is some strategies for dealing with these frustrations so that you are able to adapt and continue to move forward. So the first one there, of course, was students. So students, as a tutor, your biggest job is to encourage your students' love of learning. This does not mean that you have to be an educational expert. It just means putting in the time and effort to show your student that learning really matters. So as you all have probably realized at this point, regardless of the age of your student, kids struggle to get engaged with work or with schoolwork or to keep focus for long periods. So getting and holding a student's focus can be a constant battle. So this is why your ability to adapt to their changing levels of interest is so important. So some good tips here are always have a variety of activities to work on. Gamify more difficult projects or those requiring more focus. Gamifying being, of course, trying to incorporate game methods to make them more encouraged. A lot of kids will kind of respond if you put a point system in place, or how to win at something, or that sort of thing is always going to kind of get them a little more encouraged. And never stubbornly try and stick to a plan. Try and always be flexible with the needs of your student. Always try and adapt your methods as needed. Obviously, that can be tough, but try and remain flexible. If they're not responding to something, be willing to change it. Also, with students, as we have talked about all the way through, try and understand where they're coming from and be as patient as possible with them. And I know I emphasized that a lot in the first training, and I'm going to re-emphasize it now because there is nothing more important here. So listen to what they have to tell you, not only verbally, but through nonverbal cues as well, and pay attention to how your student is working and how they're responding to you. And with parents, of course, for some of you, you may have only actually met your student's parent or guardian once, or you have had little interaction with them since. For others, you may actually communicate with them more regularly via text, phone, or in person. Regardless, it's incredibly important that you always have open lines of communication with the family you are working with, not only for the best result for the student, but to also utilize your time tutoring as best as possible, because I know it can be frustrating if somebody doesn't show up for a session or something like that. I know that punctuality can be a frustrating experience for a lot of tutors. However, it's important to understand that we're serving these families, and therefore your flexibility with your time is key. Many of these parents, of course, are doing their best to get their students to sessions on time, but many are using, public transport, or they're having to get rides from friends to do their living or due to their living situations. So we need to be as patient with them as possible and not take it personally if a student's late to a session or if a parent does not communicate well with you. It goes a long way to ask a parent, what day would work best for them if they are having issues getting to the tutoring sessions on time. Or you can suggest maybe starting a half an hour sooner or half an hour later, just trying to kind of give them as much, as much slack as possible to work with. Because we know your time is valued. We definitely feel your time is valued. But again, going back to privilege, you have the luxury of having the time to spare to actually tutor these kids, which is phenomenal. But these parents, it might be difficult for them to actually make the time due to work and other issues, because it might be an extra burden for them that they're, of course, willing to bear for their kid, but just don't ever think that it means they owe you anything, that you're coming out to do this. It's really important to understand that we're trying to serve these guys, and I, again, really appreciate what you guys do, but it's not that we, that these families owe us anything for it. And the next, of course, is shelter staff. So when it comes to issues you may be facing with your shelter, space, or staff, always try and keep in mind the tough job that these guys have. It's an around-the-clock job, and they have their own stresses and worries. So always try and come prepared for your own sessions. After a few times, of course, you're going to know, what you have available to you and where you're expected to work. So there shouldn't be a lot of hand-holding needed for that part of it. And if it's possible to take work off their plate, they're going to be much more encouraged to help you if you show that you're trying to be helpful towards them by not making their jobs harder. Also, always remain respectful and, again, patient when communicating with shelter staff, recognizing that your care is not their priority, but their focus, of course, is on the caring for their residents. And that means that, of course, you guys have a shared goal. So always try and work together with them as a team and not against each other, because that's not going to be productive for anybody. And of course, and finally is regional coordinators. And hopefully none of them are listening just in case they don't like this part. But anyway, at School on Wheels, I get to work with a really great, amazing team of dedicated regional coordinators and have at times been able to experience kind of what they're going through in that job position myself. And I know how tough it can be juggle staying in touch with 80 plus volunteers in your region, plus dozens of shelters and families all at the same time. And of course, no one is perfect, and sometimes things are going to fall through the cracks. It does happen, no one can deny that. However, if you are struggling with communicating with your regional coordinator, try to understand that these guys, that they're trying to look after your needs, but the students do come first. That being said, a certain level of autonomy is kind of expected on the part of our tutors, because you're responsible for the preparation and you are also responsible for informing us of issues that you may be facing with your sessions. And never think that you're bugging an RC if you feel there's something you want to share or bring to their attention. These guys are really hard workers and are always willing to support their volunteers. But being a team player is really important. Note that there are a lot of other tutors in your region, and acknowledge that your RC may be dealing with several issues at once. So giving them your patience is crucial. Try working on solutions or brainstorming while they're still getting to you, so that at least when they do come to you and they are ready to help you out, you might have some things to suggest to work on. It's always going to be a lot more helpful, and trust me, they will really appreciate it. And also, volunteering to be a tutor coordinator, if you have the time, is a huge way to help out and make a better experience for your whole region. So if you have the time, after you've done the advanced training, please volunteer to be a tutor coordinator and help take a little of the work off of the regional coordinator's plate, and it'll help them also be more able to get to any issues that their other volunteers are facing. So we really appreciate those guys, and the regional coordinators definitely appreciate them. All right, so the last thing I'm going to cover, and then we can take questions from anybody that has questions, is taking care of yourselves, both mentally and emotionally. Your well-being is really important. Volunteering can be a tough gig, but putting yourself out there for the needs of others is commendable. But it can definitely add stress to your life or be emotionally draining. And that being said, self-care is so important for resiliency. A rubber band is flexible, as everybody knows, but if you stretch it too far, it's going to break. So we got to really take care of ourselves here as well. And I've worked with amazing volunteers for a big chunk of my professional career and have seen the ups and downs this kind of work has. As School on Wheels, we ask for a year's commitment, and we absolutely want each of you to fulfill that. And hopefully with the takeaways from this workshop, we can help more of you to stay with us even longer if that's possible. So some final suggestions that I want to make on how to make your time with us the best experience it can be is number one, with goals. Obviously, we already talked about goals with your student, but this is more goals for yourself. Think about what it is that you would like to achieve from this tutoring and set goals that are reasonable for the time constraints that we're working under. Also, let your goals remain flexible so you can adjust to the needs of your student, but still feel fulfilled and accomplished. A quote actually that I found while seeing that one from the last slide with Bruce Lee is another one from Mr. Bruce Lee, where he said that some targets are just meant to be aimed at. So, have things in mind, have things you want to accomplish, but understand that sometimes those things are going to have to change, and you're not always going to reach the goal you originally thought you were going to. Breaks, of course, are also important. I always try and mention the importance of this in the first training, of course, but I believe it's important enough to be reiterated. Never feel obligated to tough out a bad situation. Try to think in the long term, and if you need a break, take one. Ask yourself if the situation is still benefiting your tutoring, or if you would be better served in taking a minute, a beat, or in a whole tutoring session to step away and make sure you get yourself in the proper headspace. And always feel free to reach out to School on Wheels if you're ever in need of support. Any kind of support that you could need, reach out to us. We will definitely do our best to help you out in whatever way that we can. But make sure you're taking care of yourselves. And of course, thirdly, is support. Support is so important. I would never have been able to volunteer for 2 years abroad or 3 years abroad, more or less, without those I served with. No one here is an island, and no one here is alone in struggles or successes you may be facing with your tutoring. So therefore, take advantage of the experience of other tutors in your own region or throughout School on Wheels. Take advantage of our events. try and meet new volunteers or other tutors you may be working with in your region. Check our events calendar and see what kind of things you can come out and help us out with or just be a part of. Join our tutor corner on Facebook is a great way to get involved. Shout out questions, get answers, responses from other tutors, and kind of make a community that way. And of course, reach out to your regional coordinator if you ever want to connect with another tutor that may be facing a similar issue. They may know somebody in their region that's also going through something that you're going through, and they can kind of help you out a little bit. At trainings, swap contact information and try and keep in touch with those you trained with. That's also a good way to get started. And try and create a network of support with people who know what you're going through. Suffering in silence is not going to be productive. So, the main thing is you might have your friends and family, of course, to rely on, but, they may not know what School on Wheels is all about. So try and connect with other volunteers or School on Wheels staff for support when you need it. And of course, finally, recognize your own success. I know you may remember this as well from our first training, but it really is important. Again, we're looking at the long term here, and you may not see huge success with your student, but our main goal is to be a rock in the pond that creates a ripple and have a longer term impact on these students. I know the types of personalities that are willing to volunteer their time, and I know for those types it can be difficult not to think, about how much more you could have done. But be good to yourselves. You're all amazing just for showing up. You're doing great, and be willing to admit if you're putting in the work, you are killing the mission. You're doing a great job as a tutor. So that's pretty much all I've got. So thank you guys so much for everything you do for these students, for these families, and for School on Wheels. You're all stars in my book, and I thank you so much for your attention today. For those of you that are able to join us live, and all of those of you listening from the future in our workshop library. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions if anybody has them.
Excellent, Cody. Thank you so much. I think those last points you've touched upon were really great because we want to make sure that volunteers feel like they can find support where needed. And we do have that Facebook Tutor Corner where you can ask questions and you can just talk about issues. And then just in general, we're trying to do that more at the advanced trainings, which if you haven't been invited yet, we usually invite people after 6 weeks of tutoring. But anyone is welcome to go if they've been tutoring for a while. So we had a few questions. Let me just review that. We have some time. And please enter any more questions that you have. One was, my student has been arrested in the past and mentioned if I knew why, I would not want to be around her anymore. I tried to reassure her that that I would never judge, but I wish she didn't feel that way and that she has to hide her background. Any advice?
That's a tough situation. I would say the best advice that I would have there is if she doesn't feel like she wants to tell you, the best you can do is keep going with your tutoring sessions and just kind of be open with her and make sure she understands that it's a safe place and that you wouldn't judge her, and maybe eventually she'd feel comfortable to do it. But yeah, if she doesn't feel comfortable to let you know, it's one of those things you just really can't push on, and you just kind of have to, show her that you're a safe person for her, that you can be trusted. But it's going to be on her to actually make the decision to come out with that. And if you've already told her, you wouldn't, judge her, or that that her background wouldn't make a difference to you, that's a great first step. And really the best that you can do is just wait and see if she wants to come to you. And if not, hopefully she's learning things, outside of that.
Great. And there's another one about, I have a student who doesn't attend a regular school, and according to the student, he or she does not have a formal teacher that lectures. Do you have any tips for working with a student that may not have the typical school experience? So I guess it's like, where they do most of the coursework is done online, I expect.
Oh, okay.
I know it's a little outside. This is a combination of what we talked about and also just academic skills.
Right. Yeah, I would say like the best you can do there is, if you can, I don't know if you have access to their coursework online, if that's how they're getting it, so you can actually kind of go over what the teacher's saying, and then at least you're trying to approach it from the same direction the teacher is online. That way you're keeping that consistency for the student. But yeah, that's tough. I think that's a tough one.
No, it's a tough one. I would say, just related to this particular topic, that it's important to create that connection with that student. If they don't have a teacher, they don't have, the regular school staff, because that's what a lot of our students find comfort in, going to school, because that's consistent and they're surrounded by some support.
Yeah.
Sometimes the staff know their situation. So if they're doing this online coursework, maybe not so much. Maybe they're really in more of a silo and they need that connection. So I would say, use the tips that Cody gave to reach out. Just try to connect better, and just find out how they're doing on a personal level. Just how they're adjusting to that different environment and the struggles with that.
And I think the structure in the real world with your tutoring sessions will help them out too, because again, like Natasha was saying, most kids are used to going into school. That's their structure and support base. Whereas this student sounds like they don't really have that in the same way. So just being able to have very structured and kind of add that kind of consistency to their life with you being there, essentially you're standing in for the teacher here in a lot of ways. And I think that's really good. Yeah, it can be tough, but making those connections first and then providing structure, I think, will be the best way to help them out.
And then there was another question. How do I build a better relationship with my student's parent? Obviously, we have different lifestyles and backgrounds, so I feel it's hard to take the time to keep her updated and connect with the parent, because I'm not sure if she sees me in the same way. I guess any advice on that?
Again, working with the parents can be tough, just because, again, a lot of you may not actually see the parent very often. It sounds like you guys are at least meeting up occasionally to have some kind of relationship. So I think it's tough to have a better relationship with the parent. I would say that the best you can do sometimes is just make sure you're showing them respect when you see them, maybe asking about their day a little bit. Maybe, kind of like if you remember from the introductory training, we talk about when you first see your student for the day, have a little bit of open just conversation time, and maybe just kind of shoot the breeze a little bit when you first see the parent, just to kind of show them that you're not just there to go in and be a teacher to the student, but kind of open up and share your experience with them a little bit, so that maybe there is a connection there somewhere, even if you guys, of course, don't have the same lifestyle. But I'm sure there's still something you guys can chat about, and just to kind of show them that you're willing to open up to them and be open-minded with them and listen to what they have to say. I think that's the best way to connect with anybody, really, at the end of the day.
Great. And we have a comment, not a question, this is great, from Valerie. It says, this session has been very helpful and encouraging. I'm also a CASA volunteer. That's the court-appointed special advocates for foster youth usually. And these pointers apply to both programs that support our young people and help encourage them as they try to make their way in the world. Thank you, Valerie.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Valerie.
Yeah, you can. All our workshops are online, so you can always share them with more people. They're recorded and they're up there. Right. All right. Doesn't look like we have any more questions today, but I definitely want to thank Cody again. He's been our trainer for the introductory and some of the advanced trainings for a while, and I think this topic is very informative as well to add to it. All right.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you again. Appreciate you guys listening in. It was fantastic, and I really enjoyed doing it. So hopefully it helps you guys out in the end.
Okay, sounds good. So have a great afternoon. Thanks, everybody.